The wind howled through the streets, carrying with it a chill that seemed unnatural for late summer. It whipped through the narrow alleys and empty market squares of Galesbury, a town that should have been bustling with evening activity, but was instead eerily quiet. Every shutter was drawn, every door tightly locked. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath. Julia Strathmore pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped off the last train of the night. Galesbury was not her intended destination. She had been on her way to visit her sick aunt in the city, but a sudden storm had damaged the tracks, and the train had been forced to stop at this remote, little-known town. The conductor had promised her another train would come by morning, but something about the way he hurried her off the platform made her uneasy. Standing there, in the dim light of the station's single lantern, Julia could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. The dark sky above churned with swirling clouds, resembling brushstrokes hastily smeared across a canvas. The moon, barely visible through the shifting patterns, cast an eerie glow on the cobblestone streets, creating shadows that twisted and danced as though they were alive. "I need to find an inn," she muttered to herself, glancing around. There was no one in sight. A shuffling sound caught her attention. Julia turned sharply, her heart pounding, but saw nothing, only the flicker of the lamplight against the train station's weathered wooden walls. Her instincts told her to stay put, but the isolation made her restless. She began walking toward the town center, hoping to find some semblance of life. As she walked, she passed by empty storefronts and boarded-up buildings, their windows reflecting the unnatural brightness of the night sky. It wasn't long before she noticed something peculiar. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing at the far end of the street. They were too far away to see clearly, but Julia could feel their gaze on her. She hesitated. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cracking slightly in the silence. The figure didn't move. A cold breeze swept past her, sending a shiver down her spine. She took a step forward, then another, but the figure remained still. As she neared the corner, she saw them step backward, as if retreating into the deeper shadows of the alleyway. Her pace quickened, curiosity and unease mingling in her chest. Rounding the corner, Julia found herself facing a narrow street. It was darker here, the moonlight barely reaching the ground between the tall, leaning buildings. The figure was gone. A faint whisper echoed down the street, so quiet that Julia almost thought she'd imagined it. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the darkness. There was nothing there, just the distant sound of the wind and the creak of old wooden signs hanging from storefronts. But then she heard it again. This time, it was closer. Julia. Her name, carried on the wind. She froze. Panic surged through her veins. How could anyone here know her name? She had never been to this town before. She had never even heard of Galesbury. Fighting the rising fear, Julia scanned her surroundings for an escape. The street ahead was long and winding, with no visible end. Behind her, the figure reappeared, standing just at the edge of her vision. They wore a dark cloak, and their face was obscured by a hood. Yet she could sense the intent, the menace radiating from them. Without thinking, she turned and ran. Her footsteps echoed off the cobblestones as she fled deeper into the maze of narrow streets, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Julia, come back!" She didn't dare look behind her. She ran until her lungs burned, until the whispers faded and the night seemed to envelop her entirely. Finally, she stumbled to a stop in front of an old, crumbling building. Its once grand facade was now cracked and overgrown with ivy, the windows dark and lifeless. With nowhere else to go, Julia pushed open the heavy wooden door and slipped inside. The inside of the building smelled of dust and damp wood. Faint moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the room. It appeared to have once been an inn, deserted now, but the remnants of its past lingered in the heavy drapes and decaying furniture. Julia caught her breath, leaning against the door. For a moment, all was quiet. The whispers were gone, and so was the figure. She let out a shaky laugh, the adrenaline wearing off. "I'm losing my mind," she whispered, rubbing her temples. "It's just a strange town, and I'm tired, that's all." But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. There was something wrong with this place, something old and malevolent that lay hidden beneath the surface. A soft creak echoed from the floor above her. Julia stiffened. Someone, or something, was upstairs. She found herself drawn toward the staircase, even as every instinct told her to leave. But where could she go? The streets were dangerous, and whoever or whatever was out there knew her name. Her only choice was to investigate. The steps groaned under her weight as she climbed, the dust thick in the air. The upstairs hallway was narrow, with several closed doors on either side. Faint light spilled from beneath the door at the far end, the one at the very edge of her vision. She hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. As she approached, she could hear voices, quiet, indistinct murmurs, as though several people were speaking at once. The closer she got, the clearer they became, words of warning, of fear, of secrets long buried. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as she was about to turn it, the whispers stopped. The door swung open on its own. Inside, the room was bathed in an otherworldly light. A single chair sat in the center, facing the window, and in the chair was a figure, a woman, with long, flowing hair and eyes that gleamed like stars. She looked familiar and yet entirely strange, as though she existed outside the boundaries of time. "Julia," the woman said softly, her voice echoing through the room. "You've come at last." Julia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the woman in the chair. There was something otherworldly about her, a glow that seemed to pulse faintly beneath her pale skin. Her eyes, dark as the void between stars, locked onto Julia's with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Who are you?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She took an involuntary step back, her hand tightening on the doorframe. The woman smiled, a slow, sad smile that seemed to belong to someone who had lived 1,000 lifetimes. "I am the reason you are here," she said, her voice as soft as the night wind. "And yet, I am no one at all. Not anymore." The cryptic answer did little to ease Julia's growing unease. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, more forcefully this time. "I don't know this place. I don't know you." The woman tilted her head, as though considering the statement. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the moonlight filtered through in ribbons, casting shifting patterns on the floor. "You may not know me, Julia, but you are bound to this town as much as I am. We are all bound by something older than you can imagine." Julia shook her head, taking another step backward. "You're wrong. I've never been here before. I'm just passing through." The woman's eyes darkened, the sadness in them deepening. "No one ever passes through Galesbury. Everyone who arrives here is called, just as you were, and just as they were." "They?" Julia echoed, her skin crawling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she rose from the chair with a slow, deliberate grace, her long hair shimmering in the moonlight. She turned to the window, her gaze distant. The town has forgotten its own story, buried it deep beneath layers of time, but the past doesn't stay hidden forever. It whispers, like the wind in the trees, until someone listens. Julia felt a tremor pass through her. What happened here? For a moment, the woman didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "It began long before the town was ever built, long before the people came. This place has always been a crossroads, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. There are forces here that feed on the living. They take memories, faces, even names, until there is nothing left but shadows." Julia's stomach turned. What are you saying? That this place is cursed? The woman's gaze flickered toward her, unreadable. Cursed is too simple a word, but yes, this town, its people, are bound to something ancient. They are not as they seem. Neither am I. Suddenly, a chill ran down Julia's spine as a thought struck her. Who are you? Really? The woman hesitated, her expression tightening with an emotion Julia couldn't place. Once, I was known by many names, but now I am only the keeper of their stories, a witness to what was lost. Before Julia could ask more, the light in the room dimmed, the shadows lengthening and creeping toward her like fingers grasping at the edge of the light. Her heart raced as the air grew heavy with an unseen presence. You must leave here, the woman whispered, her voice urgent now. There is little time left. The town is waking up, and it will not let you go so easily. Julia's pulse quickened. Where am I supposed to go? The woman pointed toward the door. Follow the lights. They will guide you. But beware the figures in the dark. They will try to stop you, to draw you back into the web. You must not listen to their voices. Julia nodded, fear tightening in her chest. She glanced back at the door, then to the woman, who was already fading into the shadows, as if dissolving into the very air. Go! The woman urged, her voice barely audible over the growing whispering that filled the room. Without another word, Julia turned and ran, her feet pounding down the stairs and back into the empty streets of Galesbury. The town had changed. Where before there had been silence, now the streets were alive with the low murmur of voices, disembodied and indistinct, drifting on the wind like forgotten dreams. The houses seemed taller, their windows like empty eyes watching her as she passed, and above it all, the swirling sky had darkened further, the stars dimming as though something vast and terrible were looming just beyond the clouds. She followed the light, faint flickering lanterns that hung at uneven intervals along the road. They seemed to lead her away from the town center, toward the outskirts, where the houses thinned and the trees grew denser. But the whispers followed her. They grew louder as she ran, curling around her like tendrils of smoke, pulling at the edges of her mind. Come back, Julia. Come back to us. She clenched her teeth, fighting the urge to stop, to listen. The shadows on the edges of her vision seemed to pulse with movement, figures watching her, waiting for her to falter. Just ahead, the path veered toward a clearing, and in the center stood a single ancient tree, its gnarled branches twisting toward the heavens. The lanterns ended here, their light barely enough to hold the encroaching darkness at bay. Julia skidded to a halt beneath the tree, her chest heaving. She could feel the presence behind her now. Close, too close. The whispers were louder, a cacophony of voices rising in a terrible chorus. You cannot leave, they hissed. You belong to us now. Her heart pounded in her ears. She looked around, desperate for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The tree loomed over her, its shadow long and black against the cold earth. And then she saw it. At the base of the tree, half buried beneath the roots, was a small, weathered box. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her it was important. With trembling hands, she knelt and began to dig, the cold soil biting into her fingers. The whispers grew frantic, but she ignored them, focused on the task at hand. Finally, she freed the box from the earth and pried it open. Inside, there was a single object, a locket, tarnished with age. Julia's hands shook as she lifted it from the box, her breath catching in her throat. The moment her fingers closed around it, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Julia stared at the locket, a sense of recognition flooding over her. She had seen this before, years ago, as a child in a dream she had long since forgotten. The locket had been hers. But how? How could it be here in this cursed town? A soft voice echoed in her mind, familiar yet distant. You must remember, Julia. Remember who you are. And then it all came rushing back. The town, The woman. The night she had left Galesbury as a child, only to forget it all. The locket had been her mother's, a keepsake passed down through generations, but it was more than that. It was the key to breaking the cycle, to freeing the town from its curse. Her mother had tried to stop it, but she had failed. Now it was Julia's turn. With trembling hands, she opened the locket. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a young woman, the woman from the inn, her mother. Tears filled Julia's eyes as the memories surged back. She had been brought here for a reason. The town had called her, just as it had called her mother. But she would not be trapped here, not like the others. With a surge of determination, Julia stood and held the locket high. The air around her seemed to tremble, the shadows retreating as a soft, golden light emanated from the locket. The figures in the darkness shrank back, their whispers turning to screams of rage. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The town was silent once more. The dawn arrived quietly, casting a soft golden light over the town of Galesbury. The streets, which had felt so alive with unseen eyes and whispers in the night, were now calm, as if the town itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled. The swirling clouds above had stilled, their deep blues and blacks giving way to a pale, clear sky. But the tranquility of the morning only deepened the strange sense of finality that weighed on Julia's shoulders. She stood at the edge of the clearing where the ancient tree loomed, the locket still clutched tightly in her hand. Its metallic surface was cool, a stark contrast to the warm light that now bathed the town. As she gazed at it, the image of her mother, the woman she had met in the inn, floated in her mind. So many things that had been buried deep within her were now brought to the surface. The truth, painful and disorienting, was fully revealed. The town was free. The curse, the darkness that had preyed on its people for generations, had been broken. But it wasn't a simple victory. Julia's pulse quickened as she considered her next step. Now that the curse was lifted, she faced a choice. She could stay. She could try to rebuild a life here, in the town her mother had once fought to protect. Galesbury, quiet and forgotten by the outside world, would need someone to ensure the darkness did not creep back in. Maybe the town would remember its humanity and thrive again without the shadowy forces that had bound it for so long. But something inside her resisted that idea. She looked around, at the old buildings with their sagging roofs, the empty streets where no voices called out. There was no one here. Even though the figures in the shadows had disappeared, Galesbury still felt abandoned, like a town from a dream. Could she really make a life here? In a place so steeped in mystery and sorrow? A place where the weight of her past would always hang over her? As she stood there, turning the locket over in her hands, she thought of her mother, of the sacrifice she had made to try to end this curse long ago. Her mother had stayed. She had fought. And yet, in the end, she had been consumed by the very thing she had sought to destroy. The locket, once her mother's hope, had fallen into the soil and been forgotten, just like her memory. Was Julia destined for the same fate if she stayed? The thought filled her with dread. No, she couldn't remain here. She had come to understand the town's secrets, but she couldn't let them claim her life as well. There were too many questions still unanswered, too many unknowns about the forces that had once ruled this place. And though she had broken the curse, the darkness felt as if it lingered in the corners of her mind, waiting for her to falter, to slip into complacency. Julia's fingers tightened around the locket. Leaving felt like a betrayal of her mother, of the town, of the fight they had both been drawn into. But it was also a chance to start fresh, to live a life not dictated by the shadows of the past, not weighed down by a burden that wasn't truly hers to carry. The choice crystallized in her mind. She turned to face the path leading out of town, the same one she had run down in the dead of night, chased by unseen forces. Now it seemed peaceful, almost inviting, as if Galesbury was offering her one final chance to walk away. Julia took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill her lungs. The town no longer needed her. The cycle had been broken. Staying meant risking her own future, just as her mother had risked hers. But she had something her mother didn't: a chance to leave, to escape the grasp of this place before it could drag her under. Her memories were intact. Her life was still ahead of her. She placed the locket gently in her coat pocket. It was no longer a symbol of the curse, but of her connection to the past, and a reminder that she didn't have to repeat the mistakes that came before. With one last glance at the clearing, at the ancient tree that had stood witness to so much suffering, Julia turned her back on Galesbury and began to walk away. Each step felt lighter than the last. The whispers, once persistent and terrifying, were gone. The figures that had lurked in the shadows were nowhere to be seen. The sun rose higher in the sky, warming the earth beneath her feet. As the town faded behind her, Julia felt a weight lift from her chest. Galesbury was no longer her concern. She had freed it from the darkness, but her own life awaited beyond its borders. There were other places, other people, where she could find peace, where she could live a life untouched by the eerie forces that had claimed so much of her past. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. And so, with the town of Galesbury vanishing in the distance, Julia walked into the unknown, choosing freedom over the haunting pull of the past.